Hello, everyone. Hi, yes, I'm still alive. I know it's been a while. I'll explain all that later, but right now, we're gonna finish the World War II Mystery Iceberg. And by that, I mean we're gonna go through the last, 7 layers of it. This is like a 40-page Word doc. So it's gonna take a hot minute, alright? I appreciate y'all being here. Grab some snacks, put this on in the background, play some Apex, or do your homework, do something, and just listen to me ramble about weird shit that happened during the war. Alright? Thank you for watching. Before we get into that, I just got something cool to show you guys real quick. This is Mishka. She is yeah, this is Mishka. This is what's been distracting me a lot lately. She's a menace. Alright, run along, girl. Alright, now, let's talk about World War II. Alright, starting off Tier 3, we have the story of a man named Lauri Torni, who was a Finnish soldier that fought with 3 different militaries and was, impossible to capture. So, he was, like I say, he was born and raised in Finland. He fought in the Finnish army during the Contingency War and the Winter War, which was when, as Russia was pushing west, they tried to push into Finland, but they kind of got their shit pushed in by the Finnish. And then, after both of those wars, he volunteered for a Finnish SS type deal, basically Finnish soldiers on loan to the German army. He fought in the Eastern Front for a bit. Eventually, Finland was more or less just kind of like, hey, give us back our soldiers. So he went back to Finland. He did not like the Russians, right? So he kind of joined a pro-German cell within Finland. That was a contingency just in case Russia tried to invade again and to use guerrilla warfare or something like that. And so, because of them, he went to Germany for training. However, he was there when Russia invaded. So he joined the Wehrmacht, and then he fought with them again in Germany itself until around the time the war ended. And then he got captured by the Brits, of all people. How he got captured by the Brits fighting in Eastern Germany, I'm not sure, but that's what happened. Either way, he got captured by the Brits and then, escaped. He escaped. He tried to make his way back to his family in Finland. Didn't work out. He got captured, was arrested by the Finnish government, broke out of prison, got arrested again, and then tried for war crimes, which he was found guilty of and sentenced to 6 years, but was pardoned after 2. After he got out of prison, he followed a rat line under a Swedish alias all the way to Venezuela. While in Venezuela, he took a job on a ship going to America. And while on that ship going to America, for some reason, I don't know why, while in the Gulf of Mexico, he jumped ship and swam to Mobile, Alabama, of all places for some reason. Once he got to Alabama, he claimed political refugee status and moved to New York City, where he stayed until the mid to late 50s. At that point, he joined the U.S. Army, got his citizenship, and went to the Special Forces, where he was mostly a school instructor based on his experience in the Contingency War and the Winter War. Once the Vietnam War did break out, he went to Vietnam with the U.S. Army, and he died in a helicopter crash. His body wasn't found till the late 90s and wasn't positively identified till 2002, I think. And then once his body was positively identified, they gave him all the proper burials in Arlington National Cemetery. And to this day, he is the only person buried in Arlington with known ties to the Waffen SS. Great start to this tier. Next, we have the Polish Lost National Treasure, which is exactly what that sounds like. Basically, once the Germans invaded Poland, they kind of started taking everything that wasn't nailed to the ground, because that's what you do during war. You liberate stuff. And fearing that a lot of their important national treasures were going to be gone forever, they took a significant amount of them and kind of hid them in other countries. The Polish exiled government, or the exiled government of Poland, they took, I know for a fact, the Gutenberg Bible and their coronation sword, and they were hidden in Canada. And post-war, due to Poland being under new management of the Soviet Union, and the exiled government still saying no, we run Poland, there was a debate over who should get that stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the USSR eventually did get it. It did return to Poland under their reign. And that's really it. Like, there's a lot of Polish national treasure that's lost and missing. But I honestly couldn't find a whole lot on this one because it's a very broad topic and there's a lot of missing treasure. Because it really could have been in relation to a lot of different things, including the gold train mentioned in one of the earlier tiers, just massive amounts of treasures, or our next entry, which is the Amber Room. So the Amber Room was a architectural room made in the late 1700s out of golden amber, which is like tree sap. And yeah, so the Germans basically they built this room, and it was made by like one of like the Archduke Frederick someone, doesn't matter, some royal fucking German dude hundreds of years ago. And he gave it to the Tsar of Russia as like a sign of friendship. So they just picked up this entire fucking room out of a house and moved it to the Tsar's house. And that's where it stayed out near St. Petersburg for, you know, until the war basically. And while invading the Soviet Union, the Germans were just kind of like, hey, the Amber Room belongs to us. That's our thing. It's German architecture. We're going to take it back. And so that's what they did. They removed an entire room from a building. The room was moved to Königsberg Castle, where it was basically just kind of in there. And unfortunately, the castle was bombed by the British, bombed by the Russians, and then completely overran by the Russians. And at the end of the war, the castle was almost entirely destroyed. And the Amber Room has never been seen again. It's unknown if it was destroyed in the bombing of Königsberg Castle, if the Russians were able to move it and they put it somewhere, if the Germans moved it and put it somewhere, and it could be at the bottom of the lake, it could be completely destroyed. There's a lot of evidence to support that it was completely destroyed, but no one knows. And it doesn't help that while Königsberg Castle was not completely destroyed during the war, the Soviet Union did not allow anyone to go and investigate the castle. They didn't allow anyone to go and try to search for the Amber Room within the castle or find any kind of evidence of what had happened to it. And in the 60s, they ordered the demolition of the castle, despite like historical significance for it. So, yeah, somewhere out there, there's a Amber Room that's it's priced at like $100 million. So if you see this room that for some reason the Russians really didn't want people to see post-war, I mean, good luck finding it. It's out there somewhere probably. Or not. Probably got destroyed. Next is the Foo Fighters. No, not the band. It was several UFO sightings near the end of the war. They were first reported in November of '44 by Allied pilots flying over the Rhine. The first crew that claimed to have seen them reported, quote, 8 to 10 bright orange lights off the left wing, flying through the air at high speed. Not knowing what they were and not picking up anything from the radar or ground control, the flight crew assumed they were some kind of German weapon and repositioned to engage it, but the lights disappeared before they could. There were several other reported sightings by Allied pilots near the French and German border, with them all going along the lines of seeing 5 to 10 lights at night, and they never attacked pilots, they just followed them. In an interview with New York Times, Lieutenant Myers, a member of the first flight crew to have reported seeing the lights, Lieutenant Myers said, "When I first saw the things off my wingtips, I had the horrible thought that a German on the ground was ready to push a button and explode them. But they didn't explode or attack us. They just seemed to follow us like will-o'-the-wisps." And that was the fear for the longest time, that these were some kind of German anti-air weapon that we had just never seen before. But this was disproven after several German and Japanese pilots reported seeing the same lights. Theories have been thrown out there to try to disprove the idea that these are actual UFOs, including the idea that they were a weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, which every pilot who claimed to have seen them denied because they said they know what St. Elmo's fire looks like, and these did not look like that. Some say it was a form of mass hysteria, which doesn't really make sense to me because they were seen by pilots on both sides on every front of the war, and it's not like a British fighter pilot and flying over Germany was talking with the Japanese Zero pilot that was like crashing into ships. And others say these pilots were seeing early test flights of V-2 rockets, which all the witnesses denied since the Foo Fighters didn't show up on the radars, and when flight crews did get a good look at them, they all collectively said that what they saw was not man-made. Other theories have been thrown out there to try to explain what these were, including aliens, Die Glocke, and secret German weapons, but no one really knows. It's really all up to speculation. Alois Brunner was a high-ranking member of the SS and known as Eichmann's right-hand man, and just like so many others, he vanished off the face of the earth. Well, kind of. Supposedly, Brunner ran off to Syria, and he lived out his days with little to no issues, aside from a few assassination attempts, under the name of Dr. Georg Fischer, and he even conducted interviews, most of which consisted of him saying he was a piece of shit and regretted nothing, and how basically everyone got what they deserved. He swell guy. Fantastic dude. Apparently the Syrian government refused to allow foreign investigators to come and look into reports of him being within the country or extradition requests. It's also believed he may have been working with the Assad regime, training them on torture techniques, which kind of makes sense as to why they wouldn't let anyone look into if this guy was here or not, because he was helping them. And if you were to believe that Fischer was Brunner, then the story ends with Fischer last being seen in 2001, and it's believed he died that same year and is now buried in a cemetery in or near Damascus, Syria. But the issue comes with, one, let's say Fischer was a liar, then nobody that could have been possibly identified to be Brunner was ever found, and we don't know where he went. And two, again, the Syrian government never let anyone investigate claims, or even go into the country just to talk to him. So while that adds credence that yes, this is the guy, and they didn't want to be outed for harboring Nazis, it also, the best we could get is like, oh, we think this guy looks like what we think Brunner would look like at the age of 60, so that must be him. That's all that we could do. 3, even if Fischer was Brunner and he is buried in Damascus, the grave has never been exhumed and his body never examined to positively ID him as Brunner. The closest we have to positively IDing him is a show called Unsolved History, used facial recognition software, and they got like a roughly 95% match. And 4, if you were a key part in orchestrating one of the worst tragedies of human history and are well aware that almost the entire world wants you dead, you would not be as open and freely talking about the things that Fischer was talking about. It's either that the guy's a moron or a liar. There's really no in between, because the closest we have to someone being as vocal as Fischer is Eichmann himself when he stood trial and admitted to everything and begging for forgiveness. So it's really a 50-50 shot. Do you believe this guy is who some crazy shit in some interviews and kind of looked like him, or did he die during the war but we never found the body? Honestly, I just wish that the Israelis were better at killing this guy. They tried 5 times and failed every time. Hitler's missing globe is just as weird as it sounds. He had a big-ass globe he would keep in his office, and, well, it's missing. Logical theories say that the Russian officials took it, but the Russian government has neither confirmed nor denied that they have it. But since it was also known to be his prized possession, it kind of feeds into theories of his survival. While he usually kept it in his office in Berlin and it wasn't found there, reason to believe he may have taken it with him to the secret bunker. But it wasn't found in the bunker either, and so theories have circulated that it's proof he took it with him when he fled Berlin in a submarine. And that's really it. Take of that what you will. Hitler had a big-ass globe that Charlie Chaplin turned into a joke, and no one knows where it went. Lake Toplitz is a remote lake in a very remote section of the Alps, and supposedly there's a bunch of gold at the bottom of it. The Germans did use the lake as a test ground for its navy, and towards the end of the war, leftover fake British pounds from Operation Bernhard started washing up. If you don't know what Operation Bernhard was, basically the Germans try to make artificial inflation by flooding the British economy with a bunch of fake money. Anyway, and it led to the question of, well, once this money started popping up, what else is down there? And theories have speculated from secret documents to gold, the Amber Room, lost pieces of art, and several other items. The British Army did do a dive and found some chests full of fake British pounds and said there were more chests down there. And I know what you're thinking, well, why not just dive down there and search? Because it's incredibly deadly, that's why. The lake's only about 340 feet deep, and it stops being freshwater and becomes saltwater at around 60 feet. Not to mention branches from the trees in the area fall into the lake, and they begin to sink to about the 60-foot mark, where, the salt and freshwater meet, and they form a barrier between the two types of water, making it even more dangerous to dive below 60 feet. That and a lot of dead bodies have been found around the lake over the years. Between 1946 and 1952, several bodies, all being killed by mysterious circumstances, and oddly enough, most of these people had no intentions of doing anything with the lake. They were instead just hiking and in the area, started just kind of popping up in the area, were being found near the lake, and no one really knew why or who was doing it. They never found a killer. But if you want to risk being murdered and diving into an incredibly dangerous lake, you may find some hidden Nazi treasure. The Spear of Destiny is the spear many believed to be used to stab Christ at his crucifixion, and Hitler was kind of obsessed with it. And this is the start of what I can only call the man who hated religion was weirdly obsessed with religion. I don't know how else to put it. Hitler was staunchly atheist, but weirdly loved religious artifacts, and this is just the first of many we're going to talk about. It said the spear has special powers and was wielded by several great conquerors, which is what made him so intrigued by it. If you're curious, it was held by Attila the Hun, I believe Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and I think there's like one or two others. I can't remember who else. So much so that one of the first things he did when he came into power was Hitler took it from a museum in Vienna shortly before he annexed Austria. His fascination with it most likely due to the fact that he was known to be fascinated by the occult, which is something we'll talk about later. But yeah, he had the Spear of Destiny and thought it gave him the power to conquer the world. And strangely enough, the spear went missing for a while. And while the blade was found by Allied troops, you're never going to believe when it was found. It was found on the same day it's believed Hitler killed himself. This is a pretty interesting topic to look into, mostly due to the whole occultism and hunting for religious artifacts, which, well, like I said, this is just the tip of that. We're going to get more into it later on, and I don't want to give too much away right now. And next we have the story about the Germans in Tibet. In 1938, a group of German scientists were told by Heinrich Himmler to go to the Himalayas to officially study the rocks and geography of the area, as well as the plants, wildlife, and just kind of the Tibetan people, see how they vibe in the world, see what they do in their time. Unofficially, they were sent to investigate the origins of the Aryan race and the Atlanteans. And apparently after Atlantis sank, the survivors went to Tibet, and they were trying to find the remnants of them. We'll talk about it later on, but there's also talks of a Yeti involved in this hunt, and as well as going into Agartha, which it's believed that one of the entrances to Agartha is within the Himalayas, and that was one of the things they were trying to find as well. In fact, just from about everything I read, they found literally nothing of note, real science-wise, during their actual excursion. Really, all it seemed like they could do, from what I could see at least, because a lot of the documentation has disappeared, was the expedition crew just kind of got drunk with the Tibetans. And the last entry for Tier 3 is the Chichijima incident. In September of 44, the U.S. Navy was doing bombing runs on the island of Chichijima, about 700 miles off the coast of Japan, when some of the bombers were shot down. 9 men survived and managed to escape their burning aircraft. However, 8 of them were captured by the Imperial Army. All 8 of the men were captured and executed, and then of those 8 men, 4 were cannibalized. Yeah, the Imperial soldiers ate them. In 1946, 12 Japanese soldiers were tried for the execution of the sailors and 1 count of cannibalism. However, since military and international law didn't specify anything about cannibalism, they were instead charged with murder and prevention of honorable burial, which means it's canon cannibalism is not a war crime, okay? I'm tired of people telling me it is. Look, what I did in Yugoslavia is no one's concern, alright? But, like, that guy had it coming. I was starving. 1947, 30 more Japanese soldiers were tried, 4 of which being officers that were sentenced to hanging, 1 medical officer, and the 25 enlisted troops were sentenced to 8 years in prison. Now, Vice Admiral Mori Kunizo, the commanding officer of the Japanese troops on Chichijima Island, while he claimed he thought eating human liver had special health benefits, as he was put on trial for this also, initially. He got sentenced to life in prison, but after a separate trial in the Netherlands for his actions in the Dutch East Indies, he was sentenced to death for those crimes, and they just kind of threw the cannibalism charge in as a little extra pizzazz. Like, they already had him for a bunch of stuff. He was going to be put to death for that. And they're just like, oh yeah, by the way, he allowed his guys to eat people. Yeah, get him for that too. Prank him, John. Oh, and if you're wondering about, well, like I said, 9 dudes survived the initial plane crash. There was 1 sailor that was able to escape. He was able to avoid being captured by the Japanese. And you're never going to believe who it was. It was George H.W. Bush. Like, former president of the United States. Ronald Reagan's vice president. The guy who played a role in JFK's assassination. George H.W. Bush. I'm not joking. The man that oversaw, like, Operation Desert Storm and fighting Saddam Hussein, like, survived. Well, he was the guy that survived it. That's just wild. The man's life is not real at this point. And that's gonna do it for Tier 3. We're gonna move on to Tier 4 now. Starting off Tier 4, we have the story of the Ghost Blimp. Known officially as LA, the Ghost Blimp was a US Navy blimp whose 2-man crew mysteriously vanished on a routine patrol of the San Francisco Bay in August of 1942. Ground control lost contact with the blimp around 8:50 a.m. when the blimp reappeared off the coast of Orange Beach at around 11:15. 2 fishermen tried to stop the balloon but couldn't. However, they did notice that no one was on board. After it kind of got away from the fishermen, the blimp just kind of drifted until it landed in Daly City. The Navy and police, they cordoned off the area. They conducted an investigation, as well as a search for the crew. However, no bodies were ever recovered. And upon inspecting the blimp, they did find that it was in perfect working order. All the parachutes, life rafts, everything was still on board. The only odd things being that the engine and radio were both turned off. The official reports go that both crew members fell off the blimp while trying to mark an oil spill that they had spotted, but no one really knows what happened to them. Insert treason, murder, suicide, alien abduction, magical unicorn, and parallel dimension gateway tunnel. Take your pick on what happened to him. No Picnic on Mount Kenya is a book by Italian writer Felice Benuzzi, retelling the story of how he and 2 other prisoners of war broke out of a British POW camp and climbed Mount Kenya in Africa. And now, they didn't do this because the camp was like miserable, or because they knew there was, a Italian or German camp on the other side of the mountain, just for the sake of freedom or anything like that. But Benuzzi was just bored and decided he wanted to climb Mount Kenya, and he talked 2 other prisoners into doing it with them. That was it. So they went on their little mountain excursion, and by the time they got done with their little trip, they just went. They didn't try to find friendly forces. They went back to the POW camp. And I guess the punishment for attempting to escape was 28 days in solitary confinement, but the commander of the camp wasn't even that mad at them for doing it and only knocked it down to a week. So if you really think about it, they didn't really get into that much trouble. And I think that is just like the most wholesome thing to probably happen out of the war. It's just like, yeah, me and my buddies, we got bored being here, man. We just wanted to climb the mountain. It was really pretty. And they're just like, oh yeah, no, that's no problem, guys. Like, I feel it. It's like the most white-collar prison thing to have ever happened, ever. If you're interested in knowing more about the story, it's actually very hard to find a lot of it online, aside from just a brief synopsis of the book. You can read the book. You can get it on Amazon. And the 1994 movie The Ascent is based on the book. So if you're like me and can't read, you can also just watch the movie. Władysław Sikorski, I think I said that right. I probably butchered his name. Either way, I'm going to call him Wally. Wally was the commander-in-chief and prime minister of the exiled Polish government, and he died under mysterious circumstances in 1943. After the B-24 he was on board crashed off the coast of Gibraltar immediately after takeoff. Naturally, there's been several conspiracy theories about this. Everyone from the Soviets, the Germans, and even the British have been blamed, but no one really knows what caused it, or if someone did it, who, and why. And it's kind of weird, like, Wally's daughter was supposed to be on the plane, but her body was never recovered, as well as most of his entourage. And not only was the Soviet ambassador's plane on the runway at the same time, but the head of the British counter-intel for the region, who was also present, and he later became a double agent for the Soviets, and even admitted that he had been one since the 40s. So that kind of adds the idea the Soviets kidnapped at least some of the people that were supposed to be on the flight. And also Wally's daughter was supposedly spotted in Gulag in 45, so there's some circumstantial evidence to point towards the Soviets. Also, the sole survivor of the crash was the pilot, who, when rescued at sea, was wearing a life jacket, which I guess was uncommon for pilots to wear because they were seen as a sign of bad luck and tempting fate. However, the pilot claimed he wasn't wearing it, and the inconsistencies of his memory and the story of what happened he blamed all of it on amnesia, which is just kind of interesting. As for the Germans, it kind of makes sense why they would want to kill him. I mean, he's the leader of a country that they annexed. As for the British, I can't think of a reason why they would want to get rid of him. I mean, I couldn't find any evidence to support that. Really, everything I could find researching this only pointed at, oh, the Soviets did it. The Soviets did it. There's a lot of evidence the Soviets did it. So, yeah. Next is the Ghost Army, a secret unit in the U.S. Army they were basically just an elaborate troll that the U.S. did to the Germans. It was a unit that instead of taking any random dude that joined the Army, off the streets, they did special recruiting, and they specifically targeted actors, stagehands, artists, and dudes that worked in advertising. Basically, jobs that the Army said you had to actually be smart and or creative to do, and their whole job was basically just fucking with the Germans and tricking them. They were the guys that would set up the fake airfields, fake defensive lines, and bases using inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, stuff like that. They also did what I can only describe as auditory trolls. No, they didn't drive around playing like Rick Astley or Battle of New Orleans. They did something called sonic deception, which I don't really know how to explain aside from they basically strapped a giant speaker to half tracks and played sounds from them that could be heard for miles around. So the Germans didn't know exactly where the noise was coming from. They would also jam Morse code nets by mimicking actual code operators, so if the messages were intercepted by Germans, they never really knew where they were or if the information was accurate, which I know that sounds kind of weird, but apparently you can tell who a person is by their Morse code setting. I guess it's kind of like writing. And if you have four dudes all Morse code, Morse code is a very hard word to say repeatedly. But if you have four dudes all Morse coding at the same time, saying they're all the same person and unit, but in different locations, you're going to get a little frustrated. You're not going to know which is which. And also, the commander of the Ghost Army claimed he discovered Amelia Earhart and is the reason she became famous. I don't know how true that is, but I think that's just a nice little cherry on top of this one. I think something about the Ghost Army would make a pretty decent film or miniseries. The next entry requires a little bit of context. It's about a man named Glenn Miller and how he disappeared. Glenn was a big band orchestrator, and he was really popular back in the day. Like many other celebrities, he had joined the Army Air Corps, and he led a marching band and ran a radio station out of London, and he more or less just kind of made music as a morale booster for the troops fighting when he disappeared. On December 15th, 1944, Miller got on a plane and was supposed to fly from England to Paris in preparation of moving his band to Paris, but his plane never arrived and vanished over the English Channel, with the plane and bodies never being recovered. The most probable cause was the plane was hit a cold front and crashed into the channel. And because it's a mystery, there's wild conspiracies, including They were mistaken for a German plane and shot down. They actually made it to Paris, and Miller died in a brothel. And my personal favorite, he was assassinated after Eisenhower sent him on a secret mission to negotiate a peace treaty with the Germans. I want to know where the evidence for this theory is. I want to know the mental gymnastics that people went through to come up with a major in the military that was a big band operator could end the war. That's ridiculous. The Blutfahne was a flag that the Nazis carried during the failed coup in Munich of 1923, and it had gotten some blood on it during the coup attempt, and it kind of became a big deal for the party due to its historical significance. It was just kind of like, oh, this is the flag from the coup that failed. The flag was last seen on October 18th, 1944, and it's not been seen since. No one knows what happened to it. It was either destroyed when the Allies bombed Munich, or some army private took it as a war trophy, and it's in a shed on a farm somewhere here in the States. So if you happen by chance to come across it, I'd recommend selling it to a museum, because I'm more than willing to bet it is a very significant historical artifact worth a very pretty penny. So next is Rommel's gold. So Erwin Rommel was a high-ranking general in the German army and is often known as Germany's best general during the war. He was also known as the Desert Fox and was the reason you could say the Germans were so successful in Africa. And during this campaign in Africa, the occupation of Tunisia specifically, the Germans stole a lot of gold. Like a lot of gold, like they always did. And they tried to send it back to Europe, where it's believed it sank off the coast between Italy and France. And that's really it. It's just another supposed German gold hunt that has never been found. Axis Sally was the Nazis and Italians version of the Tokyo Rose. They were women who would do pro-Axis radios in English across Europe. I say Axis because there were two Axis Sallys, Mildred Gillers, who spread German propaganda, and Rita Zucca, who spread Italian. Their radio stations would play swing music, and in between songs, the girls would spread messages to try and scare Allied soldiers, saying stuff like, "We know where you are, and your girlfriends are cheating on you, and like our dicks are bigger." And I don't know what they would say to the Brits, but the US soldiers would listen to Giller because they liked the music and they thought our propaganda threats were really funny. And fun fact, Mildred Gillard was the first woman in US history to be found guilty of treason and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but was let out on parole after serving just over 12 years. As for Rita, the US government tried to put her on trial for treason, but she renounced her US citizenship before she became an Axis Sally, so they couldn't do anything. Also, Mildred was doing it first and was really upset when she found out that Rita was using the same alias and was just kind of like offended. It was like, oh, that's my name, which I don't know. I think that's kind of comedic. But the Italian government then put Rita on trial for collaborating with Mussolini, and she was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, but she was released after 9 months since the government declared amnesty for all collaborators. Rudolf Hess was the deputy Führer of the Nazi Party, think kind of like a vice president, and in May of 1941, for some reason, he flew by himself to Scotland in an attempt to make peace talks with the Duke of Hamilton. He did this completely of his own volition. And while Hess was not smart, he thought he could just fly a bomber over the entirety of the United Kingdom, land in front of the Duke's home, and just sit down and have a chat with them, and basically say, hey, we want peace, Germany and the United Kingdom, but it's going to be on our terms, and you have to say, and you have no say-so. Obviously, that did not happen. The Royal Air Force dispatched planes immediately to intercept him. They actually didn't find Hess. He ran out of fuel and had to eject his plane, and a farmer found him. They took Hess to the cops. Eventually, Hess was able to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. I should mention, as he was parachuting, he messed up the landing and twisted his ankle or hurt himself somehow. And, Hess kept telling him look, I need to speak with the Duke. I gotta speak with the Duke. And again, the cops eventually were like, okay, fine. And Hess told the Duke, hey, let us do what we want and we'll leave you alone. Let's have peace, brother. Obviously, it didn't work. He was held prisoner for the rest of the war and was charged with war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. He was then sentenced to life in prison when he died. And also, while doing research for a later topic, I found out apparently he would practice magic. Not like magician magic, but like pagan magic with a K. He also tried to read minds and consulted astrological star charts when planning military operations. So Rudolf Hess was a fucking character. Like, I weirdly want a dark comedy about this guy's attempt to talk to the Duke of Hamilton and negotiate peace with like a Mr. Bean level of like incompetent Rudolph as the lead character, just making fun of how stupid he was, because it's just beyond satire how funny it is. Next up, we have Joseph Mengele and twins. Joseph Mengele was a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, a medical officer at Auschwitz, and a doctor. I use the term doctor very, very loosely. In all reality, he was a sadist and conducted horrible experiments on innocent people, mostly children, in the name of what he called medical research, which is another term I use very, very loosely. Basically, he would do horrific experiments on twins, and he would do the experiments on one twin and use the other as the control, and he claimed his depravity was all under the name of eugenics, because twins are perfect for it for some reason. Ironically, the use of twins in eugenics experiments proved all justifications for eugenics under his like mindset as completely wrong, and just even dumber than what eugenics already are. And that's really it. Like, chocolate, it's tank chocolate, was meth chocolate the Nazis gave their tank operators. There's really not much else to it. The Nazis thought it was a good idea to give their soldiers drugs because they weren't the brightest. I mean, your guys are gonna have energy for the next 5 days, but you know, don't worry about the fucking long-term ramifications of what meth is gonna do to you. No, that's not an issue. And with the talk of chocolate, we're gonna end Tier 4. Starting Tier 5, we have the story of the 3,000 lost Chinese soldiers. In December of 1937, 3,000 Chinese soldiers, known as the Nanking Battalion, were in a defensive position just outside the city of Nanking, with their objective being a simple one: to keep the Japanese that had taken the city from exiting it. And on the night of December 9th, 1937, they all mysteriously disappeared. The commanding officer awoke to find his men gone without a trace, with their weird thing being there was no sign of struggle, all machine gun positions were still intact, hidden fires were still going, and it was as if 3,000 men had just gotten up and walked away. The even weirder thing about it is Chinese soldiers still in the area reported they hadn't seen any movement, and there were no sounds of fighting during the night. Now, obviously, you're not going to not notice 3,000 dudes just getting up and all walking at once. To add to it, these soldiers knew what the Japanese would have done to them, so surrendering to them would have been a fate worse than death. Not to mention, in all the years that followed, including their apologies for the atrocities that happened in Nanking, the Japanese have continually provided evidence that states they took no prisoners during this battle. There's also the debate if this ever happened. If you want more information on it, Nick Crowley and Bedtime Stories both have videos on the topic, and I highly recommend them. They're both really good and go into a lot more detail than I can here, because I still have like 1,000 more things to talk about. I honestly couldn't find a whole lot on this one. It's Pete Ellis's predictions, at least if it's the Pete Ellis I think it is. He was an officer in the United States Marine Corps back during World War I, and after the Great War, he had a sneaking suspicion Japan was going to eventually attack the United States. So he wrote the book on amphibious warfare, and I mean, he was right, and his book did end up becoming the doctrine that the United States Marine Corps followed during the island hopping campaign, and that the U.S. Army used during the invasion of Normandy. But there's really not any more to this that I could find, at least. I don't know if he made any other predictions. As far as I know, he just was really good with foresight and prepared accordingly with a master class of assaulting, because his book is still used as doctrine today. So Tokyo Rose was the Japanese equivalent of Axis Sally, a woman who made pro-Japanese propaganda radio broadcasts with the goal of lowering U.S. morale. Unlike Axis Sally, there were several women who took on the role, not just two, and to my knowledge, only one has been identified, Iva Tuguri. Her story and how she was charged with treason and later pardoned is actually a really interesting one. You can read it for yourself, or Wendigoon has a real good video talking about her. And in terms of the identity of Tokyo Rose, every time you try to search for it, everything just pulls up Iva. And just know that there were other women who took on the role. She's just the most known one. The Philadelphia experiment was an alleged attempt by the US Navy to develop invisibility and teleportation. I'm not kidding. Now, obviously the Navy and government deny this and say it wasn't a thing, but I mean, of course they would. The Navy saying invisible force fields are impossible, which, yeah, of course they would say that. It sounds silly, saying it out loud. But in the fall of 1943, the crew of the SS Andrew Furuseth claimed to have seen the USS Eldridge arrive in Norfolk, Virginia via teleportation, and then quickly disappearing and then reappearing back in Philadelphia. This is one of those tricky ones to prove since the government denies it ever happened, and all you have to go on as evidence is the testimonies of the Furuseth's crew, specifically a man named Carlos Allende. Allende wrote a letter to Morris Jessup, an astronomer and author at the time, explaining what he saw and how it proved Einstein's theories on unified fields, which is science stuff I'm not in any way smart enough to explain. But then in the late 50s, the Office of Naval Research sent Jessup a copy of his own book on UFOs and how they may work, with a bunch of annotations written by 3 people in it. Some of the writing people believe may be an alien, or at the very least someone whose first language isn't English. Seriously, I've seen people claim both. It's either a dude who just didn't know English well, or an actual alien from another planet. And O&R decided to publish that version of Jessup's book with the annotations. This is one of those things that probably didn't happen, at least how they were presented, but at the same time, do you trust the government? I mean, I don't. Hermann Göring was a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party and the founder of the Gestapo. He eventually took a backseat from politics and the war because the German people didn't like him very much, because why would you like the guy that sets up the secret police? But he lived to the end of the war and was arrested in a part of the Nuremberg trials where he was found guilty and sentenced to be hung. However, the night before he was to be hanged, he took his own life with a cyanide capsule while in prison. Now the obvious question is, who gave it to him? And where did he get it? 2 major theories are: when Göring was first brought in for trial, all of his belongings were taken, including the cyanide, but he was able to convince an army lieutenant working at the trials to give him a capsule in exchange for a gold watch, pen, and cigarette case. The other theory is a U.S. Army private serving as honor guard for the trial was asked by a German woman to smuggle in what she called medicine for Göring via a fountain pen, which he did not knowing what the pill was until after Göring was dead. Take of those what you will, just know this guy decided to end his own life mere hours before it was going to end anyway, and it's not known 100% why he did that. I guess he just wanted to go out on his own terms. If anything, I'm more inclined to believe the private story over the lieutenant's, since he was in custody and didn't really have anything to barter with, or he shouldn't have, and it's easier to believe that some German woman who was friends with Göring's, or at least knew him personally, knew he wouldn't have wanted to be hanged, and got the private to break the rules, mostly by playing the booby game. Either way, both of these stories have massive holes in them, so I don't know which would be right. Might be a third option, who knows. The portrait of a young man was a painting by Renaissance artist Raphael the Nazis stole from the Polish royal family when they invaded Poland. It was last seen in possession of Hans Frank, a high-ranking member of the Gestapo. It was last seen at the Wawel Castle in early 45, and was thought to have been put into storage somewhere when the Germans were forced to withdraw from Poland due to the Red Army's advances. The Red Army's advances through the country, but it, along with hundreds of other pieces of art, have been missing. Since its original frame hangs in the Polish National Museum in Krakow, and it offers a $100 million reward for the painting's return. For some reason, this painting is super important and incredibly significant. I don't know why. Not an art person, so I couldn't tell you. The Alpine Fortress was a proposed redoubt for German government and military officials to fall back to come worst case scenario. That never happened, mostly because Hitler decided they didn't need a redoubt. It wasn't a necessary thing. If you don't know, a redoubt is basically a place for government officials to run and hide to if a capital is overtaken by an invading army. The fortress is supposedly somewhere around southern Bavaria, crossing into Austria and north Italy, which is a massive chunk of land, but the idea of the fortress was never taken seriously. However, some preparations for it and a bunch of treasure were hidden there around the region, so it leads people to believe some preparations were taken for it. While the idea of the Alpine fortress was real and is documented, I couldn't find anything on the exact whereabouts or if any construction was actually put towards it. If you ask me, the idea of it was more interesting than just more hidden gold. Proposed Project Rice is one of the more peculiar things on this tier. Basically, in 1943, the Germans started building tunnels throughout the Owl Mountains in Poland. None of them were finished, and no one really knows why they built them. Logical theories state that they were holdout bunkers for air raids or escape tunnels. Others say that they were for testing weapons. We don't know, and some are super basic, simple tunnels. Others are super complex, borderline underground base complicated. Since no one knows what these tunnels were for, or there's no real documentation on them, people began to speculate, and you have theories that they relate to the gold train mentioned in an earlier tier, to like everything in between. It's let your mind run wild. It's whatever you think they are. You have an idea. There's also an idea that all of the tunnels were supposedly connected and formed an underground city. Secret society for weird cult stuff, probably. Starting tier 6, we have the disappearance of Gertrude Silver. Gertrude was a member of WASP, the United States Army Air Corps of Women's Service Pilots, and she was set to fly a P-51 Mustang from LA to New Jersey when she took off on October 26, 1944, and was supposed to land in Palm Springs Refield, which is only about 120 miles from LA, but she never arrived. A search was conducted on land and sea, however her plane and body were never found. Despite this, in 2010 another search was launched, and they searched the Santa Monica Bay, but nothing had come up, which is weird because I mean that's not a huge chunk of land to like go missing in, and a lot of it is vast empty desert, so it's just mind-boggling. Like where could the plane have gone? Because everything I looked up, she was a competent pilot, she was capable, she knew how to navigate, so it's just weird. Lady Be Good was a U.S. bomber that disappeared on its first combat mission. The mission was pretty cut and dry. They were to fly from Slouch Field in Libya and partake in the bombing run on the island of Naples, and on the way back to Slouch Field, the Lady Be Good and her crew disappeared. Initially, it was thought that Lady Be Good crashed or was shot down over the Mediterranean Sea, but that wasn't the case, as the wreckage of the Lady was found in 1958, 400 miles inland. The crew was all new, like brand new, and this was their first combat mission, and on their way back to Slouch Field, they overshot the actual airfield due to a sandstorm and eventually crashed. 8 of the 9 members of the crew did survive the crash and were able to regroup, however, they were not able to survive the desert. Like I said, the remains of the Lady Be Good were found in May of '58 by British Petroleum, the oil company. 2 years later, in 1960, the U.S. military conducted a formal search of the area that ended in August of 1960, during which the remains of 8 members of Lady Be Good's crew were found. The story is actually a really interesting one to me. I'm more than likely going to do a video going further into depth of this story, just kind of talking about the members of the crew and like what they had to do to survive and all of that. Yamashita's gold is more supposed gold stolen by the Axis powers and hidden, never to be found. The only difference is, this time it was gold stolen not by the Nazis, but by the Japanese, under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who conquered Malaya from the Brits in just over a month, and it's believed to be hidden across the Philippines. It should be noted that this treasure was potentially found as a guy sued the president of the Philippines over it. The long short of it is a guy named Rogelio Roaxis met a guy who claimed to be Yamashita's interpreter and pointed him towards some of the gold, and the lead turned out to be true, but it's also not officially Yamashita's gold. The president of the country at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, caught wind of Roxas' treasure and had him arrested. So after Marcos left office, Roxas filed a lawsuit, with the Hawaiian courts, of all places. I'm not sure why in Hawaii, but in Hawaii. And though Roxas passed before the trial ended, he did end up winning with his estate receiving $22 billion. So on the upside, the corrupt politician didn't win. The little guy won that time. Masanobu Tsuji was an officer in the Japanese Imperial Army who oversaw the planning of their invasion of Malaya and the final Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. He also had a hand in the Bataan Death March. He was an ultra-nationalist and militant, to put simply. He was a pretty shitty person, and he just up and disappeared in the early 60s. Unfortunately, he never stood trial for his crimes. Instead, he ran into hiding, going into countries like Thailand, China, Vietnam. Eventually, he returned to Japan and held a political office. He tried to overthrow the government, which failed. Then he went to Laos in 61, but was never seen again. There's three big possibilities of what happened to him. One, he got killed in the Laotian Civil War. Two, he became an advisor for the North Vietnamese. Or, if you believe the CIA, they claim he was a spy for them, and he got captured by the Chinese Communist Party and imprisoned in a gulag, with the last known date of him being alive being based on handwriting analysis being August 8th, 1962. I don't really know, because they would take former enemies. We took former enemies and made them useful to us in our own ways, but I don't think, just based on what this guy did and who the nationalism he felt for Japan, I don't think he would have fought for America in any sense of the word. So I think more than likely he probably just died in the Laotian War, or he fought with the Viet Cong. One of the two. Chanel is a big name fashion designer. Her line is still actually really popular today. It's the Chanel brand. All your basic rich white girls, they probably wear all that. Well, plot twist, the company's founder, Coco Chanel, was a spy for the Nazis. Yeah, I know, that's kind of weird to think about that. She was alive in that time period. I always thought Chanel became a thing in the 70s. Anyway, she was living in occupied Paris when she met and started dating a high-ranking German officer whose name was Dinklage. I don't know why I think Dinklage is a funny name. But the Nazis brought her in as a spy, and she used her connections as a fashion icon and personal friendship with Winston Churchill to try and spy on the Brits. But as far as I could find, she wasn't a very good spy, or at the very least couldn't get any important information. And when Paris was liberated, she fled to Switzerland, and when the war ended, she wasn't really charged with anything, and everyone just kind of forgot she was a spy, which is how are y'all just gonna let her slide with that, dude? Constance Manzi-Arley? Yeah, Constance Manzi-Arley was Hitler's personal cook, and when the Red Army began its invasion of Berlin, she was one of the many people brought into the secret bunker. However, on April 22nd, 1945, Hitler demanded Constance and two other women leave the bunker. The three left the bunker on May 1st, but were captured by the Soviets on May 2nd. She was last seen being taken by Soviet soldiers into a U-Bahn subway, with her last words being, "They want to see my papers," and she was never heard from again. To be honest, more than likely she was shot and killed in the tunnel. I really don't know why this one's on here. You try searching for her online anywhere, that is literally all you will find, is that small amount of information. The German plan for South America was, they saw it as, if they were going to control all of Europe, they really left the US as an economic partner to trade with, and figuring that probably wouldn't work out, the Germans began planning to build South American countries like Argentina up economically, as well as planning on invading the continent, because of course they would, to use it as a staging area to invade the United States. As mentioned earlier in the iceberg, several members of the Nazi Party did flee to Argentina and other South American countries, and it's believed that they went there not only because they knew they could easily hide out, but to plan to come back with the Fourth Reich as well. As far as we know, it didn't work and has failed. It should be noted that we're getting to the point where some things are kind of hard to research and explain, so there's going to be a lot of short entries and a lot of vaguer than what they've been, while also a lot of super in-depth. It's going to get a little weird. Neuschwabenland was a German expedition to Antarctica where they laid claim to some land, and it's theorized that this was the start of their building a secret base down in the Antarctic region, which we have talked about earlier and we'll go further into later on in the iceberg, with Operation High Jump, which was a Navy operation in 1946. It was officially to test the Navy's capabilities in Arctic environments. Unofficially, the mission was for the U.S. Navy to follow leads and rumors of Nazis fleeing to Antarctica, and it was their attempt to find the secret snow base. Obviously, the U.S. government and Navy have never admitted that this was the purpose of the operation. They've stayed true to it was a test for the Navy's capability in the Arctic, so we don't really know how successful it was. This was also the operation where Admiral Byrd claimed to have made contact with Agartha and spoke to the leader, also known as the Master. And if I'm not mistaken, the Master told Byrd that the Nazis were there, but they didn't let him stay, because I guess the Agarthans are based like that. Erich John Hausen was a hypnotist, clairvoyant, occultist, and all that fancy stuff. And it's alleged that he actually regularly met with Hitler and taught him his tricks on crowd manipulation. Erich would go on to predict the Reichstag fire that happened shortly after Hitler was sworn into office, which would be used for him to gain absolute power. And it's believed this led to Erich's assassination. The vision is seen as his greatest feat of clairvoyance. However, the people that didn't really like him and didn't like how close he was to Hitler chopped it up and reconstrued it to he spilled the plans to the of the party. He basically let it go, oh yeah, hey, that they intentionally burnt down the Reichstag to give Hitler more power. Others, if you believe in mediums, actually believe he did predict it, which I don't know. I mean, I really don't even know what to make of this one. Alright, so next entry is MI6 Occult Combat, which is a very vague topic, and bear with me on what I could find, but it may not exactly be what the author of the iceberg meant. But the MI6, if you don't know, is essentially the British CIA, and they used magic during the war. You may have heard of a man named Aleister Crowley. He was a British occultist. He found the cult Thelma, and basically a lot of modern spirituality, paganism, counterculture of the 60s, and all the weird shit astrology girls believe in can be linked back to Aleister in some way or another. And the reason why I bring up Aleister is because he was supposedly a spy for MI6. The British government knew he had some form of ties to Germany. At the very least, he got medication from the country. And so they were like, hey man, you wanna mess with the Germans for us? And he was like, fuck it, why not? Well, and obviously because the Allies knew that the Nazis were kind of weirdly into the occult, so who else to fuck with them but the king of occultism? He basically used his stance in the world occult community to make contact with these high members of the Reich that believed in all that, they believed in all that and gave them false information. Aleister claimed he also made the V for victory, like doing this, the thing Winston Churchill was famous for, trend in England, but I couldn't find any evidence to support it. He just said he started it. There's also a book called Secret Agent 666, which is about Aleister Crowley and his work with the MI6, the use of the occult during the war, and that is very much a book I'm going to read and expand on all of this and just Aleister Crowley, because he's just an interesting dude in general, later on in a completely dedicated video to that itself. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was a British soldier, better known as Mad Jack, and he was a mad lad, to say the least. Just to show how out there and bizarre this guy was, I'm just gonna read what the opening of his Wikipedia article says. Quote, a British Army officer who fought in the Second World War with a longbow, bagpipes, and a Scottish broadsword. Nicknamed Fighting Jack Churchill and Mad Jack, he was known for the motto, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. Here are just a quick summary of some of his actions during the war. During Operation Archery in Norway, he left his amphibious landing boat playing March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes, threw a grenade, and then charged into the battle. In Italy, he and a corporal captured a German observation post, taking 42 prisoners. After walking the prisoners back, he went back to the observation post to get his sword that he had lost in hand-to-hand combat, which is... He ran into an American patrol, mistakenly walking to enemy lines. The guy in charge of it wouldn't turn around, and he returned to friendly lines. Mad Jack responded by saying he was going his own way and that he wouldn't come back for a bloody third time. In 1944, Jack was captured by the Germans while conducting an operation in Yugoslavia. When they found him, he was playing Will Ye No Come Back Again on his bagpipes. He was released from being a BOW. He was redeployed to Burma, and by the time he had reached India, the bombs had been dropped on Japan and the war was over. It was reported that Mad Jack was actually very upset by the sudden end of the war, with one of his quotes being, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. So, yeah, this guy was definitely someone who loved war. He loved the fight, which is whatever. I mean, it's just a thing with dudes that are like in the infantry, right? Like you just love the combat. It's a great adrenaline rush. You get addicted to it. But I just want to bear in mind, this guy walked around with bagpipes, a bow, and a fucking sword. Was in the 1940s. The 40s. Machine guns and tanks and Amtraks were a thing. And this guy was fighting like a medieval fucking like knight. And it's just, could you imagine the utter fear and terror as you see a man playing the bagpipes and just lobbing grenades? That is just abstract horror. And then when you, God forbid, you break the man's bagpipes, I guarantee you he charge at you with a sword and chop you up and serve you to your friends for dinner. I want something commemorating the absolute insanity of this man. He needs to be idolized and memorialized in some way. He is a real-life Chuck Norris. He is beyond legend. 364th Regiment of the U.S. Army was an all-black infantry regiment, aside from the officers, that unfortunately dealt with racist issues and discrimination from the Army. The unit was initially stationed in Arizona. The men within the unit would fight for equality and to be treated equally, including writing Congress and senators, just asking for basic human dignity and respect. These letters would be intercepted by the command, however, and the troops who would protest their mistreatment were labeled as troublemakers. Because all these men protested their mistreatment, the Army punished them by relocating the unit to Mississippi. They got punished for wanting equality. The 40s were a fucked up time. Shortly after getting to Mississippi, a member of the unit, a man named Private William Walker, was being arrested by the military police for missing a button on his uniform. Walker fought back justifiably because that's a bit of an overreaction. Like, as you can see by this little sign here, like I was in the military, and I can tell you now, like, PMO, you give MPs an inch, they will run a marathon with you. But like, that's like a whole new level of, like, they ran like 3 triathlons with this man for no reason. Like, that is an overreaction. The county sheriff saw that, the MPs were hassling this guy, so they shot Walker, and members of the 364th found out about this whole situation, so they stole arms from the armory and were ready to get revenge. And no one officially knows what happened after that. They do know that the unit was disbanded. Most were sent to the Pacific and were effective in repelling Japanese assaults. A rumor claimed over 1,200 members of the 364th were lined up and shot by white soldiers and civilians while in Mississippi. The incident, known as the Camp Van Dorn slaughter, has been consistently denied by the U.S. Army, yet between June of 43 and 1945, when the regiment was disbanded, over 800 names had disappeared from the regimental roster. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. Army and the NAACP conducted a joint investigation, and while they did find a lot of evidence of mistreatment and missing records related to the 364th, no one found any evidence to support the Camp Van Dorn slaughter theory, leading the fate of the 800 soldiers an official mystery to this day. And with that, we end Tier 6. I'm sorry it couldn't have been on a happier note. Starting Tier 7, we have this tale of the pilotless P-40 plane. On December 8, 1942, the U.S. Navy intercepted a plane flying over Pearl Harbor. Thinking it was another Japanese attack, it turned out it was an old P-40, an older model of the U.S. fighter planes at the time that had been shot up, the landing gear broken, and the pilot dead. The P-40 crashed, and upon investigation, they couldn't find the pilot, but found a diary that claimed the plane took off from Mindanao. The story is believed to be made up and a slight alteration of the story by author Robert Lee Scott, as the first chapter of his book Damned to Glory is basically this story, only he said it in China and not Pearl Harbor. Scandinavian ghost rockets were a weird incident that happened in 1946, as there were several reports throughout Scandinavia, Sweden mostly, of rocket-shaped UFOs flying in the area. These sightings were investigated, with first thoughts being it was the Soviets testing captive German V2 rockets, but were kind of thrown out due to lack of evidence, and no one really knows what they were, or at least if we do know, those that investigate it have not officially released what they were. Next we have the identity of William Martin. For those that don't know, William Martin was the false identity made up by the British government for Operation Mincemeat, a deception tactic to lure German troops to Greece in preparation for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Operation Mincemeat, essentially what the plan was the Brits set up a body with a bunch of documents to wash up on the shore of Spain in hopes that all the paperwork would end up in German hands, and for the longest time, no one knew whose body the British government used. They wanted a young fighting age male who could reasonably be determined to have died from drowning, and so they found a body off the streets of London. Martin wasn't properly identified until 1996, when it was revealed his real name was Glyndwr Michael, a homeless Welshman who was believed to have died by ingesting rat poison while in London. It's unaware if he did this accidentally or if it was an attempt to take his own life. But that's how he passed. The government said, oh, he fits what we need for this job, and he was able to serve the British government in death. While there is some debate on if Glyndwr was Michael, most agree that it was him. The British 17 was a list of 17 British soldiers that were held prisoner at Auschwitz, and that's all I could really find on this one. No one knows why they were there, if they were just POWs, defectors, or what have you. The only one I could find anything on was a man named Arthur Dodd, who was a British soldier captured in Africa and imprisoned in Auschwitz, but I couldn't find anything else past that. Yang Kyung-jong was a Korean soldier who served in the Japanese Imperial Army, Soviet Red Army, and German Wehrmacht, aka he's the most unlucky man in the world. In 1938, Yang was conscripted into the Imperial Army, and during the Battle of Koklin Gol, he was captured by the Soviets, who eventually conscripted them into their army and sent him to the Eastern Front to fight the Germans. The Germans captured him during the Third Battle of Kharkov. The Germans then sent him to Normandy, which is where he was on D-Day. He was captured by the US Army after the invasion of Normandy, and obviously, initially the United States Army thought he was a Japanese soldier, and they had captured him and 3 other Asian men. Obviously, they thought it was really weird that they captured 3 Asian men who were fighting for the Germans, but not a single one spoke German. They thought that was a little weird, a little confused by it, but Yang was eventually sent to an Allied POW camp, and that's where he spent the rest of the war. He was released and stayed in the United States, where he lived a normal life before passing away in 1992. There is a very famous photo of Yang, which will be somewhere here, I don't know where, and yeah, that's really it. There's some debate on if Yang is the man in the photo, but there is documents to prove that Yang Kyung-jong was one of the 4 men that were captured by the Allies, and all 4 of them corroborate the same story of they were in the Imperial Army, the Red Army, and the Germans captured them, and that's where they ended up. His story is actually really interesting, and if you want to know more or see more of it, there's a South Korean movie called My Way, based on it. It's based on it in his time in the war. You can watch it on Amazon for free. It's really good. The ending's a little... I didn't really like the ending that much, but outside of that, the movie's pretty decent if you ask me. So, you remember how back in an earlier tier I mentioned that there were supposed submarines that snuck high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, including Hitler, out of Berlin, and they took them to either Antarctica or South America? Well, those submarines were U-530 and U-977. That's all there is to it. They supposedly did that. Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm was graffiti that appeared near Worcestershire, the impossible sauce that no one knows how to pronounce, England. After the remains of a woman were found in a witch elm, a type of tree. The skull of a woman was found by 4 boys in the tree, and they told the police, who then found her entire body. An investigation was launched, but the woman still hasn't been identified. In 1994, the term "Who Put Bella in a Witch Elm" that then started appearing in Birmingham. Theories have ranged from Bella being a sex worker to 2 men put a drunk woman from the pub in the tree to, quote, frighten her, hoping she'd see the error of her ways. Which is just... what? I don't see the logic in that. And that's just a horribly cruel thing to do to someone. And even to... theories have also ranged that Bella was a victim of witchcraft and an occult ritual, the Hand of Glory. Which, yeah, I mean, it's just a weird murder that happened during the war that no one knows the answer to. Nazi trees is a bit of a weird one. There was a batch of trees in a northeast German forest that are arranged in such a way that they stand out as a swastika due to their discoloration. No one knows when they were planted or by who. In fact, they weren't even reported on until 1992, and fearing backlash over the trees, the German government did go and remove them, and as far as I know, the site is no longer visible, but I could be wrong about that. And the Andean jungle hideouts were discovered near Paraguay that are believed to have been used by the Nazis, but ultimately abandoned because they were able to hide in the open in places like Argentina. I really couldn't find anything super concrete on this. Every article I read described the sites as just old ruins, but they found Nazi money and German pots, but it also read as kind of clickbaity articles, so take that with a grain of salt. The Hohenbu Nazi aircraft is the actual name of the Nazi flying saucer. Obviously, they were researching weird things and looking into propulsion technology, and it's theorized that they might have tried to make these. Some believe the Foo Fighter was a prototype of this aircraft, as well as other incidents like the Kecksburg UFO, and it can even be related back to Die Glocke. There was also a claim by 2 former German scientists that claimed in 1945 they saw moving turbines around a fixed cockpit, and it reached over 40,000 feet in 3 minutes and could travel around 1,400 miles per hour. And that is a mighty bold claim to make with no evidence, and that is a wild judge of height and distance, just like eyeballing it. There's no. The Kecksburg UFO is the name given to a big ball of fire that crashed near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania in 1965, and no one really knows what it was. In 2005, NASA came out and said it was a Soviet satellite, but that's a little too convenient and has been really doubted. As soon as the UFO initially landed, the crash site was immediately closed off by the Army and State Police. However, when they began their search of the area, they found absolutely nothing and denied any proposed ideas like satellites, missile tests gone wrong, plane crash, what have you. At the time, they said it was nothing fell from the sky, don't question us, we're the government, trust me, we know what we're talking about. It's funny the government said it was both a natural phenomenon and nothing happened, and that it was just a meteor. They changed their story like 5-6 times on this because they feel the need to hide UFOs every time they happen. Like I said, it's theorized this UFO might have been the Hohenbau, but that's one of many theories. Most say it was aliens. Like I said, it's funny because NASA said it was a satellite, but when people requested the files on the incident using the Freedom of Information Act, all the files were accidentally lost back in '87, which is just so convenient. So convenient. Alexandria Land Base was a secret base the Germans had on Alexandria Island off the far north coast of Russia. Codenamed Treasure Hunt, the base was officially a weather station, which isn't too out of the ordinary. They had weather stations all over the world to help them track weather because it gave them better forecasts on how the weather would be in Europe itself. But because of the base's name, people have started speculating that this may have had a part in the Nazi artifact hunting or at least treasure hiding. The base is actually a very recent discovery. I think the oldest article I found on this was from like the summer of 2016. So not a whole lot is known about it, and given what country it was in, those guys, they like to hide stuff, especially when it comes to like from the war, for whatever reason. I don't know why. So the actual entry on the iceberg here is just Nazi search for the Holy Grail, but I'm just going to kind of incorporate all of their artifact hunting here. And I want to preface this with, one, what I'm about to say are not my views on religion. They are those of a psychotic man, and two, I'm not saying religion is bad. I'm just providing some historical context. It was actually a little ironic when Hitler openly praised Christianity, mostly to get the people on his side. While he was actually a devout atheist, he believed Christianity was absurd and claimed it held society as a whole back. And it wasn't just Christianity he held these beliefs on. Several high-ranking members of the Reich held beliefs in astrology, occultism, paganism, things like that, and he thought they were all kind of stupid for believing it. The dude was basically a Reddit atheist before Reddit atheists were a thing. If that makes... yeah. Yet despite this negative mindset on religion, he was completely okay with hunting for religious and superstitious artifacts. While most of it was spearheaded by Hitler never really said no and kind of was open to the idea of it. He held things like the Spear of Destiny mentioned earlier, and it's said whoever holds that would rule a vast empire. Those Indiana Jones movies, where the Nazis are after things like the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail, those are based on fact. They actually did look for these things. Granted, the hunts were mostly conducted by Himmler, like I said, but Hitler was all for trying to find them to get any kind of edge he could on his enemies. Himmler started a group within the Reich called Abernetber, which would hunt for these artifacts. They were also the ones that sent a research group to the Himalayas, hunted for Agartha. They looked for the Fountain of Youth. It should also be mentioned that Hitler was obsessed with the Ghent altarpiece, which is believed to have coded map to supernatural treasure, and the location of Thule, a magical land similar to Agartha from the Icelandic saga, the Edis. And if all of this was found, the Anbernadi were to go investigate, basically. Hitler would find something he thought was interesting, get the smallest lead on it, and he would tell Himmler would send his guys, and they'd go look for it. That was the setup. Obviously, as far as we know, they found nothing. They were just a bunch of crackpots, but this is a whole rabbit hole you can go down, and I recommend you do. I just barely scratched the surface, and it's just a lot of research. I can make a whole video just on this. Hell, there are probably videos on this. Just the occult aspect of everything. Starting tier 8, we have Aleister Crowley in World War II. I'm not going to get into this one because A, I already touched on it earlier, and B, I want to do a whole video dedicated to Aleister because the whole situation is really interesting, and I just want to share how much of a whack job this guy was. Leslie Howard was an English actor, most notable for his role as Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind. And on June 1st, 1943, he was on a commercial DC flight that was shot down by the German Air Force, and no one really knows why they shot down his commercial air flight. Because you see, it wasn't like, he wasn't in like a military plane, he was in a normal, it was like being in a Boeing 747, just flying over the Atlantic. It was a civilian plane. It would have been constituted a war crime to attack him. Theories have been put out there, such as the Germans thought Churchill was on the plane. Another push by Howard's son is that the Germans specifically targeted him because, see, during the war, Howard regularly starred in anti-German propaganda and constantly showed support for Allied troops, and the Germans want him gone as either a blow to morale or because Goebbels, the German head of propaganda, was upset that Howard made fun of him in a movie, and I believe that Goebbels would be that petty and not be able to take a joke at his expense. It should be noted, though, that one of the pilots that shot down Howard's plane was eventually captured by the British, and when questioned on why he shot the commercial airplane down, or if he had known who was on board, his response was, "I didn't know who was on board, and I've shot down 4 commercial planes. Whatever crossed our path, we shot down." Conspiracies also developed that he was working with the British intelligence groups, and Howard knew his plane would be hit and he would become a martyr to protect British intelligence and the fact that they had broken the German code enigma. So do with that information what you will. If you ask me, this is a clear case of wrong place, wrong time, though. Dead Man Floating, I couldn't find anything on it. Everything I did just went back to Operation Mincemeat, the story of William Martin from the last year. So if it is something else, I couldn't find it, please let me know. Operation Foxley was the British plan to assassinate Hitler that never took off. The plan was actually quite probable and could have been done. What they would have done was they would have parachuted in a British sniper, a German-speaking Pole, and into Austria, disguised as German troops. A local man who hated the Nazis was recruited to help them. This local man would have helped them infiltrate the area near Berghof Castle, where Hitler liked to take walks in the woods around the castle alone in the morning, and he'd specifically go into areas that were out of sight of guards. So he would do these walks with no security. It was the perfect place to, take him out. The idea was they would have snuck in, shot the shitty mustache guy and disappeared before anyone was any wiser. The plan was ultimately scrapped as Allied High Command feared that this would have made Hitler a martyr. The idea at the time wasn't just to stop Hitler, but destroy the National Socialist ideology altogether. And they thought that if they killed Hitler, we killed him, but then it fed the idea of Germany's gonna sit there and think we have to do this for him now. Like I said, that he would have become a martyr, and killing him honestly would not have helped, unfortunately. Tojo remains is an interesting mystery, and it was actually recently solved. If you don't know, Hideki Tojo was the Prime Minister and General of the Imperial Japanese Army. He was essentially to Japan what Eisenhower was to the US for most of the war. After the war, he was arrested and tried for war crimes, of which he was found guilty and executed on December 23rd, 1948. And no one knew what happened to his remains for years. They had just vanished mysteriously. That is until June of last year, 2021, when a professor from Nihon University in Japan revealed documents that stated his remains were cremated and scattered into the Pacific Ocean east of Yokohama. Apparently, the reason for the U.S.'s secrecy for the whereabouts of his remains was to deter ultranationalists from trying to get his remains and parade the man as a martyr. So it was kind of out of respect for the dead, we don't want his body to be disrespected or used as ammunition for violence. Which I kind of respect, if we're being honest. It's a respectful thing to do with the remains of your enemy, if you ask me, because the man was responsible for atrocities, but again, no one was innocent during the war. I think that's something people have to remember. Everyone committed war crimes. Everyone did it. But take that as you will. I think people show their true character when they know death is certain, so I give him the benefit of the doubt. Apparently some of his last words after being sentenced to death were he apologized for his atrocities and war crimes he not only committed personally but oversaw, as well as asking the U.S. to show compassion to the people of Japan as they have suffered enough. Which, if you ask me, I think we weirdly honored his wishes. That's just my opinion, though. So I think I found the right thing for the WW2 ad. I might be wrong, bear with me on it. It's my understanding that there was a dice game back in the day called WW2 that had an ad in the New York Times 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor that had a coded warning for the attack, as you can see from this picture. People naturally point out that the ads were considered too accurate to be considered a coincidence, so the FBI began investigations, and surprisingly enough, there were no games available at the time, and it's really up to interpretation if you want to say that this was a weird coincidence or a covert message from the Axis to warn their conspirators. I should add that most people thought the game wasn't real, there wasn't any evidence of it until this guy posted a thread on Reddit with a picture of the supposed dice game, but it's also a random Reddit post, so take it with a grain of salt. And it's definitely, if you look at the ad, it's a super weird, it's one of those, Simpsons predicted the future type, conspiracy things where it's that's really convenient, but I don't know, it's just weird like that. The Awa Maru was a Japanese ocean liner that was requisitioned by the Imperial Navy to be used as a Red Cross relief ship while sailing from Singapore back to Japan, and it was shot down by the U.S. Navy. The ship had taken on several hundred personnel, as well as several $1 billion worth of priceless precious metals and jewels. Only one crew member survived, and none of the treasure from the Awa itself has been recovered since. And that's really it. No one knows or knew where the remains of the treasure are. That was until 1977 when the Chinese government found the ship and began searching for the treasure. However, it was never recovered. The Thule Society was a secret society that was officially active in Germany from 1918 to 1925, and it eventually evolved into the Nazi political party, as many of the sympathizers and founding members of the Thule Society were also a part of this group and thought it, even though it didn't start as a political group. Obviously, these people are very twisted and had wrong views. The group officially disbanded in 25, but it's believed to have lived on and was incredibly influential within the party, and they are the cause of the Nazis' interest in the supernatural and religious artifacts and all the occult shit. And yeah, this is just the cult that kind of ran the Nazis. The Kugelpanzer is one of the funnier things on here, as Kugelpanzer literally translates to ball tank. It was a little one-man tank that was made by the Germans and given to the Japanese for whatever reason. There was only one example of this thing ever being a thing, and it was captured by the Soviets in Manchuria. And as you can see the tank for yourself, it's on display in a museum. And that's really it. It's just this funny little tank that was made for some reason. Like, I can't imagine just being on the battlefield and seeing this little guy roll up to you, just like, it's like some dude is like, yeah, I'm gonna take them all on. It's just like, look at the little ball. Look at the little ball of death just trying to roll towards us. It's hilarious. It's adorable. I mean, just look at that thing. You can't take that serious. The Owlhead bomber crash was a story of a supposed German bomber that crashed off the coast of Maine. See, after the US entered the war, Germany started looking into developing a bomber that would be able to reach the United States, and supposedly they made one and attempted a flight that was unsuccessful. The story goes, in mid-September 1944, an elderly couple was out on a stroll at the Owl's Head Lighthouse in Maine when they noticed a plane was approaching from the horizon. It was dark green and black with 6 engines. As it flew over the open water, it appeared to be in trouble, making a slow and constant descent until one wing brushed on the surface of the ocean. Witnesses then lost view of the large aircraft. An investigation of the area began, but nothing was found. About 10 days later, a trio of corpses washed up on the beach. Sources claimed that one of the deceased wore a gray-blue uniform similar to German Luftwaffe signal corps uniforms. Now, it wasn't uncommon for the government to cover up such instances to keep the American public calm, but they didn't do a good job of that here. The military said that what the people saw was not a plane, it was a submarine. How you mistake a submarine for a plane in the sky, I don't know. But yeah. Obviously, a very sufficient number of witnesses insisted that they saw an airplane, and the government officials told them in no uncertain terms to forget all about it. They're like, no, you didn't. You did not see a plane. That didn't happen. No, they did not come close to flying a plane to us. Consequently, the curious-minded dropped their pursuit of the truth, and that's it. Supposedly, a German plane crashed off the coast of Maine, and the U.S. government covered it up. Why they haven't admitted to it all these years later, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, it's completely, I don't think anyone would care at this point. Closing off Tier 8, we have the Werewolf Plan, which is nowhere near as cool as it sounds. It was the Germans' plan to essentially have a bunch of civilians and supporters that were behind Allied and Red Army lines conduct basic guerrilla warfare strategies. Soldiers would disguise themselves as civilians, they would do harassing techniques, all that cool stuff. They really didn't do a whole lot, aside from assassinating a few minor politicians and military officers. I'm not gonna lie, I went into searching this one expecting to the Germans were looking into making werewolves. That was not the case. Needless to say, my disappointment is immeasurable and my day is ruined, because with all the weird crackpot shit that they were trying out, werewolves are not too out of the ordinary or too far out of the question, if you ask me. And with this, we end Tier 8 and move on to Tier 9. And starting tier 9, we have Operation Cone of Power, which is one of the greatest "there's no way that fucking happened, but it happened" moments in history. In 1940, near the south coast of England, at the start of the Battle of Britain, near the town of Highcliffe-on-Sea, I kid you not with this, a group of witches got together and conducted a magical assault on Hitler's brain. I'm not kidding. They did this so-called assault in an attempt to stop Germans from conducting full-scale invasion of the UK. Now, apparently the ritual itself was so intense, 2 people died from it. And I'm not saying it worked, but what I am saying is the Germans never launched a full-scale invasion of the United Kingdom, so take that as you will. And Mishka, what are you doing? Why are you being obnoxious? Operation PX was a planned but never executed operation by the Japanese Imperial Army that, thankfully, this one never happened. The operation was intended to use biological warfare against the United States, including sarin gas, weaponized bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and dengue fever. Targets for the initial operation were major cities on the West Coast, California cities mostly. Thankfully, the plan wasn't carried out thanks to the Chief General of Staff, Yoshijiro Umez. General Umez, the base Chad he was, basically said, "This is a really dumb idea. You idiots are going to cause a worldwide epidemic, and everyone will blame us." So thank him for talking sense into the other generals, because that would have just been horribly, terribly bad for everyone. Jean-Marie Loret was a Frenchman who lived a pretty normal life. He worked at the rail yard, he fought in the war, he had a wife, a couple kids, pretty normal dude, and supposedly he was Hitler's illegitimate child. Allegedly. The long short of the story is Jean was born in 1918 in the town of Sibancourt. Hitler was reportedly positioned, I don't know what the right word for it is. His unit was in the area at the time. According to eyewitnesses, Jean's mom and Hitler were dating, and Jean popped out 9 months later. Now, obviously, people were quick to doubt this. They did a DNA test that came back with a maybe, we don't know. So it's his word over others. He had no evidence to support his claim. It was literally just, dude, trust me, that was his source. It should be noted that the soldiers who served with Hitler during World War I, for the most part, said he was super against German troops having relations with locals within France, and would chastise people for it, claiming that they didn't have German honor. He did this as a private, which is just really funny. I hope his senior leaders hazed him for this. I really do. And we also have the track record of the 30 years following the war, so I don't think Jean-Marie was telling the truth, if I'm being honest. Gail Rabal was Hitler's niece who mysteriously unalived herself on September 18th, 1931. She was living with him in Munich for the last few years of her life, and surprisingly, Hitler was super controlling and abusive, so much to the point he made her in a relationship with a guy she wanted to marry, and forbid her from going to Vienna to continue singing lessons. She wasn't so much of a roommate, more of a prisoner. I know, it's a shocker. One of the biggest assholes in history was also an asshole in his personal life. Who would have thunk it? Apparently, after an argument over her going to Vienna, Hitler left to go to Nuremberg for a meeting, but was recalled back to Munich after it was discovered Gail had shot herself in the lung with Hitler's gun in his apartment. But the cops ruled it a suicide. Now, Hitler wasn't in charge of the country at the time. He was just a radical politician, but the cops still said it was a self-inflicted unalive. The media and Hitler's political opponents used this against him, mostly by claiming he was sleeping with her. Supposedly, Hitler went into a depression and was super upset by her death, but he didn't go to her funeral, and he visited Gail's grave 2 days later, magically curing his depression so he could refocus on politics. Bear in mind, all of this happened between the 18th and 26th of September 1931. Now, I've been in depressive episodes. I know people that have, and I'm sure some of you can speak to this too. You don't cure depression that quickly. You don't get over something like that fast if you actually did care about them like he claimed he did. So, yeah, Hitler was a cousin lover who shot his niece that he was loving. There's also speculation that the family knew they had been together physically, and she might have been pregnant with his kid, so there's a bit more motivation for him to have done it. Yeah. And you remember how back in the earlier tiers I mentioned that the Germans did an expedition to Tibet to find the origin of the Aryan people? Well, apparently, origin of Aryan people meant Yeti. Apparently, some of the high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, specifically the ones in the cult Anarbeer and Thule Society and all that, they thought Aryans were just built so much different that they evolved from the fucking Yeti. This whole thing was spearheaded by Himmler, the crazy occult dude of the Reich. He just thought the Nazis, and only them, evolved from Yetis. I don't know where he got this idea, and it's purely asinine. Like, of all things, the Yeti. Like, no, dude, y'all probably evolved from swamp things, not Yetis. As for Bigfoot, which, if you ask me, the Yeti and Bigfoot are slight deviations from each other, evolution-wise. Think like a German Shepherd or a Belgian Malinois. They're the same species and very similar animals, but slightly different. I couldn't find anything aside from the movie The Man Who Killed Hitler and then Bigfoot starring Sam Elliott when looking up the Nazis and Bigfoot, which it is a good movie. It's as good as that sounds. Like, I'm not even gonna lie. Mount Slezia, located in Poland, is a popular occult spot due to it being the origin of an ancient cult within Poland. And surprisingly, I couldn't find anything related to that and the Nazis on this entry. I actually couldn't find much on this aside from it being a potential place for the gold train to be hidden, as there are large caves in the town at the base of the mountain leading into it. Some expeditions have been done and they did find some treasure and paintings, but as far as I know, they haven't done a full exploration of the cave systems just due to how dangerous they are. Weather Station Kurt was an automatic weather station the Germans set up in northern Canada that broke like a month later. The Germans tried to disguise it as a not German thing. They put trash like packs of American cigarettes around it. One part was marked Canadian Meteor Service, but they misspelled it. The Canadian Meteor Service also isn't a thing. After it was set, it was just kind of forgot about until a dude named Peter Johnson found it in 1977, and he completely came across it by chance. He wasn't even looking for it. He thought it belonged to the Canadian military, so he just kind of left it. He didn't think anything of it. A co-worker of Peter's saw his reports on the weather station a few years later and thought it was kind of weird, so he reported to the Canadian Department of National Defense, kind of like the civilian sector of the Canadian military, if that's the right explanation of it. I think it's a rough idea of it. They sent a team to investigate, and they found it, and now the weather station Kurt is at the Canadian War Museum. And it's really weird to think that Canadians have a museum dedicated to war, considering they're all super nice and friendly. And there's really not much else to it. The Germans technically invaded Canada with a submarine just to put a weather station in Newfoundland that immediately broke, and they didn't bother to try to fix. Like, they went through all that trouble and risk to put it there, and they didn't even bother to fucking maintain it. And we are finally at the last tier. If you made it this far, you are pretty awesome, and I love you. Starting the last tier, we have the Benka Island Massacre. It was a tragedy that occurred on February 16th, 1942, when Japanese soldiers opened fire and took the lives of the survivors of the sinking of the USS Vern Brook. Those killed include crew members of the ship, 60 Aussie and British soldiers, and 22 Aussie Army nurses, with Lieutenant Vivian Bullwinkle, Eric German, and Stoker Ernest Lloyd being the only survivors. Just a few days prior to the incident, the Viner Brook was sailing away from Singapore just before the Japanese had conquered the city. The Viner was sunk by Japanese bombers, and those who survived managed to make it to Benka Island. At the time, a part of the Dutch East Indies, the civilian women and children went to Montauk and kind of surrendered, attempted to blend in with the local populace. The nurses stayed to help the wounded when they were captured shortly after the Japanese soldiers. They had the men stand in the water and they opened fire. The Imperial soldiers assaulted most of the women in that kind of way, and then had them go stand in the water as well. As I said, Lieutenant Vivian Bullwinkle and Ernest Lloyd survived and spent the next 3 years in a POW camp. Lieutenant Bullwinkle would give evidence of the War Crimes Tribunal. However, no one was ever actually charged, unfortunately. The Malbork mass grave is actually a recent discovery. It was only discovered in 2009 in Malbork, Poland, where construction workers unearthed the remains of 1,800 people. They were found in a mass grave, naked, with no identification or any kind of metal, not even fake teeth. And they also found that around 1 in 10 people were actually shot in the head. Malbork was a town called Marienburg and part of Germany. It only became a part of Poland after the war. While they don't know where these people came from, it's widely believed that they are mostly German citizens that were killed during the Russian offensive, either just straight up shot as the Russians were moving through the town, the weather got them, or artillery blast, and then they were all just kind of collectively thrown into a mass grave. And that's really all there is to this one. So as I'm sure you know, the US was not the only country looking into making nuclear weapons during the war. The Germans were also trying it, and ironically enough, they weren't able to make them because all of the top German scientists that would have been able to make it were Jews that fled to America and helped us make our bombs. Or is that the case? Well, yeah, it is. Kind of, for the most part. The Germans technically made a nuclear weapon first, but not the same aspect as, like, the Fat Man with the Little Boy. They developed what was basically a dirty bomb, which is when you put a bunch of explosives around uranium and blow it up. And they tested it on Rügen Island, about 100 kilometers south of Berlin. Now, unfortunately, they used concentration camp victims as test subjects, and they weren't able to build on it, more partially because they didn't have uranium. Supposedly Hitler also wasn't a fan of nuclear weapons, which I don't believe, and based on all the wild shit he was looking for an advantage. I mean, the man was okay with finding the Ark of the Covenant, but you're telling me he wasn't okay with an atomic weapon? Are you serious? And by the end of the war, the Germans were just kind of getting their shit pushed in and from 6 different directions, so they didn't really have the resources to continue the development of the weapon. Werner Heisenberg was the father of modern quantum mechanics, and Niels Bohr was a physicist that helped contribute to the understanding of atomic structure. And in September of 1941, they had a conversation that to this day, no one really knows what they talked about. It's been highly debated on what some say they talked about the war, others say they talked about Karl von Weizsäcker, nuclear energy. Some even say Heisenberg predicted that the war would end with the use of a nuclear power, which is a very, very accurate prediction. I mean, granted, with all he knew, it's understandable, but yeah. So Operation Overlord crossword puzzle incident, it's actually kind of funny, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Some of the key code words for the invasion of Normandy, including Utah, Omaha, and Overlord, as well as some other words, were answers in the Daily Telegraph crosswords in May of 1944 and on June 1st, just 5 days before the invasion took place. Apparently, Leonard Daw, the guy who wrote the crosswords, was the headmaster for a local school, and he would have some of the kids help him, fill in the words and make the crossword puzzles. The school was near the camp the U.S. and Canadian troops were stationed at, and the camp was pretty lax about security, and it's widely believed that the boys that would periodically help the headmaster would talk to, or at the very least overhear, U.S. and Canadian troops, and that's where they would get the code words from the operation, not realizing the security risk. MI5 saw this and went, that's a fucking problem. So they went and interrogated the headmaster and a colleague, and they concluded that it wasn't intentional, it was completely by accident. Leonard asked at least one of the kids, and it turns out he did get the words from the soldiers. He reprimanded the child for the whole loose lips sink ships, Operation Security, and times of war, you can't be saying stuff like that. And yeah, the whole invasion that won the Western Front of the war was exposed by a crossword puzzle that thankfully no one caught on to, or would try to decipher, which is good. And our last entry is here, finally, and it's Hexen Karthatek. And yes, it's only last because of the name. And no, I can't pronounce it. Hexen was an investigation by the Nazis, spearheaded by Himmler, because of course it was, in which they investigated witch trials from the last 300 years, believing that witches were the origins of the German people, and that it was all a mass conspiracy by the church to eradicate German heritage. The same guy who thought that Aryan Germans evolved from Yetis also believed they were descendants of witches. The idea was, again, to prove that the church was conducting anti-German campaigns, and this is often what gets Nazis listed as Europe's first pro-witch government. All the information they gathered was supposed to put together in a book and published as anti-church propaganda to convince the German people to leave the church and form a more magic-based lifestyle. They didn't have any real evidence, and all they had was made-up stuff, so that's why the book never really happened. They had no, solid proof because it's ludicrous. It was just the church burning women because they could do math, not because they were German. But that doesn't make the whole situation really funny. Just beyond it. It blows my mind that these people were able to conquer as much of the world as they did. They were able to do everything they did. But they were just so incompetently beyond recognition of just dumb. They believed the dumbest things, they followed the wildest rumors, investigated the most dubious of claims, tried the most outlandish ideas, and yet somehow they were still able to do everything that they were able to do in conquering the world. It's honestly mind-boggling. How are you so stupid yet so capable at the same fucking time? How are you so competent and able to invade all these countries and stand your own against all these countries for a few years? But at the same time, you're out here looking for religious artifacts and studying and looking for cryptids, and you're looking for gateways to the underground. I don't know. It's weird to me. They were so dedicated to science and advancements like that for the good of the world and the good of the people. Granted, they committed atrocities and they were doing it in the worst way possible. But then they were also oh yeah, let's do blood magic and let's sacrifice people to the devil because why not? I don't know. It's fucking mental to me to think that these were the same people that did both of those things. With that, we are going to end this now. I appreciate you sitting here and listening to me ramble. I know I've been gone for a while. All 5 or 6 people that regularly watch my content. I really appreciate you sticking around and just kind of waiting for me. I know it's been a while. It'll be probably close to 2 months by the time this actually gets finished. As much as I do enjoy doing this, again, life has just been busy. You gotta remember, this is not my 9-to-5 job. This is a hobby for me. And unfortunately, work has just kind of taken over my life recently. And like I said, this is not my job. So there's really not much I can do. I've got to pay the bills, and this is not paying the bills. So yeah, hit me up on the social medias. Tell me where I was wrong, if I was wrong, or that I'm a hack. Tell me what you thought. And yeah, I love you. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.